Good morning, everybody. As you're joining us, we're just going to wait a minute or so for everybody to get into the room, and then we'll get started. Well, good morning, everyone. I think we're ready to get started. It's 9 a.m. in Victoria, a little later in the UK where Graham is zooming in from. I'd just like to welcome you. My name is Chris Kilford. I'm the president of the Canadian International Council branch here in Victoria. And welcome to our members, our guests, our guest speaker. Jonathan also is our moderator today, and I'm glad you could take the time to join us. Before we do get underway, it's important to recognize that CIC Victoria members live, work, and learn on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish, and we give thanks to the Lekwungen people, now known as the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations, for allowing us to meet on their traditional lands. For those of you that are not familiar with the CIC, we are an independent, nonpartisan, membership-driven think tank, and we have this express mandate to engage with Canadians on topics of international affairs that are important to Canada. And we have branches in 18 cities across our great country with some 1,300 members, and we have quite a number of them right here in Victoria. In the chat section, I've added my email and a spot also where you can click on if you are not a CIC member and wish to join. You can just click on there and join, and we would really appreciate that you do, because we could always use your support. Now, how we're going to handle today is very similar to the events we always do, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. But I will, after introductions, Graham is going to speak for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll have an audience Q&A portion. And for this portion, please just use the Q&A section at the bottom. If you look down on the screen, if you scroll over, you'll see the Q&A portion. You can type your questions in there, and we're going to do our best to get to all of them. And we also have 3 copies of Graham's book on hand here in Victoria. And after the event today, we'll randomly draw 3 names, only from our CIC Victoria members, of course, and then we'll get those books to whoever is chosen. So as mentioned, our moderator is Jonathan Manthorpe this morning, and he really needs no introduction if you're in Victoria or Canada, or probably anywhere else in the world. But he has spent 40 years as a correspondent in Canada and internationally. He's been based in Europe, Africa, and Asia, and he's quite the prolific author as well, having written on Taiwan in 2008. He has his best-selling book, The Claws of the Panda, Beijing's Campaign of Influence and Intimidation in Canada, that came out in 2019, has become this terrific bestseller that's being translated into Japanese and Korean, and has already been translated in other languages as well. And of course, in 2020, his book, Restoring Democracy, came out. So Jonathan, thank you for moderating today, and I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Chris. Well, it is a huge pleasure to introduce Graham Hutchings to you. Graham and I have been friends we met in Hong Kong when I was the correspondent there for Southern News, and Graham was the China correspondent for the Daily Telegraph. So at that time, we were a sort of brotherhood, because we were both spear carriers in the legions of Conrad Black, we carried on our friendship after that. Graham went back to Britain after the ceding of Hong Kong back to China in 1997, and he became the managing editor of Oxford Analytica. Now, for those of you who haven't come across Oxford Analytica, it is without doubt the best daily news sheet and analysis of international affairs that there is. Its customers are governments or government departments, international banks, international corporations. It is a magnificent publication, and Graham was there as managing editor for many years. He's now an associate of the University of Oxford's China Centre, and he's also an honorary professor at the University of Nottingham. He's written a marvelous book a few years ago, this one here, Modern China, a companion to a rising power, which for any of us who think and write about China is an essential reference work to have at hand. It has all the dates and all the quotes and all the background that you ever need when you're thinking and writing about China. But today we're here to talk about his new book, 1949, which is the whole transition of China from the rule of the Kuomintang to the Chinese Communist Party is a fascinating period, and that has not had enough attention in the past. And this book, I think, fills a huge gap in our knowledge and understanding of what happened over that transition period in the early 1940s and 50s. And so I will turn it over now to Graham to please tell us about the new book.
Well, Jonathan, thank you very much for that gracious and generous introduction. It is much appreciated, and thank you, Chris, to you and to your colleagues for making this opportunity happen. I'm especially grateful to all of you who have tuned in at this important time of your day in Canada. I know that I have some friends and acquaintances who have supported my work over the years are present with us today, and I'm delighted that you can be with us as well. I'm going to share my screen, and I hope that that now is working for you. I want to begin, I suppose, by asking the question of myself, is it somewhat arbitrary to write about 1 year in China? Because we know that the great tide of events that constitute history do not generally acknowledge and conform with calendars, whether they be Gregorian, Napoleonic, or in the case of the Republic of China, that which begins in 1912 with year one, as I'm sure I needn't tell many of you taking part in this session this morning. That's generally the rule, but in the case of 1949, it so happens that we have a concatenation of circumstances that fall within a calendar year and enable us to frame within that time span a series of events. Now that in a way constitutes the icing on a cake, because there is something more substantial at work here. 1949 is a fundamentally important year in terms of China's modern history and evolution, as Jonathan was just alluding to there. When one is a historian looking at archives, has the advantage of perspective and hindsight and distance, it's relatively easier than a chap or a woman on the spot to make judgments about a year. I've had the advantage of the former, but the man who's made the quote that you can see on your screens now, who was Lieutenant Colonel Drury, the assistant British military attaché in the embassy in Beijing, did not. He was asked early in 1950 by his masters in London to give an account of the significance of 1949, it being very plain the world over that something remarkable had happened in that year. And he said, it will go down in posterity as a memorable year in Chinese and world history. He added, this is particularly true of the military sphere. He, of course, was in uniform and focused on that dimension. Never before has a civil war been waged with so many troops over so vast an area. Over 5 million nationalist and communist soldiers have been engaged, while the victorious armies, in many cases, have finished up well over 1,000 miles from where they started and have crushed all organized resistance by nationalist forces on the mainland, with the exception of a few armies scattered over West China. Well, as I say, he focused on the military dimension, but 1949 is much more important than simply a matter of men in arms and military conquest. It is an inflection point. It is the year which saw the foundation, the creation of the People's Republic of China. And it inaugurated a root and branch reordering of public and private life. A fundamentally disruptive force, you might say, the Chinese Communist Party, was determined to uproot the old China and replace it with a new order, to be called New China, or in the West, somewhat pejoratively, Red China. It was also a critical year in the history of the Soviet-led international communist movement. Now, for very understandable reasons, we don't hear much about that these days, but it was very consequential at the time. Mao's victory in 1949 brought the most populous country in the world into the global socialist camp. Broadly speaking, you might say that China had, for the previous century, much against its will for some of the time, perhaps, been in the Western orbit. Now, there was an interlude, of course, with the Japanese Congress, but broadly speaking, it had been in the Western orbit. Since 1949, it has never been so, despite the dreams of certain Western leaders. And of course, 1949 was the final year, in some respects at least, of a bitter civil war raged across vast swathes of the country. This was a civil war like all others, wherever they occur, that tore families apart, that sundered friendships, that ruined millions of lives and forced hundreds of thousands into exiles. Yet it was also the source of enthusiasm, an idea that something was being born with which Chinese people could identify and of which they could be proud. So we see human triumph and exaltation coexisting with tragedy on a colossal, often heartrending scale. And not least, of course, about 1949 is the fact that whereas we had one China at the beginning, the Republic of China, led by Chiang Kai-shek, about more of whom in a moment, it ended the year with two Chinas, a division that still endangers Asian security and indeed casts a long shadow over the entire Asia-Pacific region and beyond. So we have in front of us, and the subject of my book, a series of events that are momentous, that are humane and human in their dimension. And what I'd like to do in our time together is undertake a journey through this year, a spatial journey as we move from North China, generally speaking, in the direction of South China, and a temporal journey through this calendar year of 1949. And I want to stop at various episodes during the course of this year, various vignettes, to spend a little time in the company of certain personalities, to ponder on various occurrences, and to dwell a little, if we can, in the vicarious experience of those who went through these traumas, hopefully to end up in December 1949 and in about 20-25 minutes time with a richer understanding of what happened in that year and indeed what the significance of that year is for this present day. We ought, of course, to familiarize ourselves at the beginning with the two principal players in this contest, Mao Zedong, for the avoidance of any doubt, at the top, and Chiang Kai-shek at the bottom. Mao, the undisputed leader of the Chinese Communist Party, Jiang, the still disputed leader as the year begins of the Kuomintang, the head president indeed of the nationalist government. How do we find the mood and the disposition of these two men at the beginning of our year? Well, we find them in different places, naturally. They are at war, and we find them in very different moods. Jiang is in his capital, outside Nanjing, I beg your pardon, outside Shanghai. Nanjing, the capital, is perhaps one of the most modern cities in China. It's the seat of the national government. It's on the Yangtze there, 100, 150 miles or so up the river from Shanghai. Jiang is about to convene a soiree to mark the inauguration of the new year 1949 in his residence. He's got the civilian elite of his party with them, and he has a momentous announcement to make. He's forced to make this announcement because of the horrors of the year that's preceded the one that's about to begin. In 1948, Jiang's army has lost Manchuria. They are about to lose nearly all of China between Beijing and Shanghai. The Americans, previously ready to support his regime over long periods, have turned their back on him. His wife, Sung Mei-ling, has gone to the United States to plead for more money. She is returned with a modest amount of tea and close to zero sympathy in a meeting with President Truman. Jiang decides that he has to take a course of action he'd long set his face against. He'll have to step down as president to clear the way for peace talks with the communists. And that's what he says to the astonished gathering that evening in Nanjing. The fireworks are set off. There is fine food in the traditional Chinese manner, but there is also the sound of distant artillery fire because the PLA, Mao's army, is just across the other side of the Yangtze. As for my own position, he tells his astonished guests, I have no concern at all. As long as peace is secured, I will follow the will of the people. He's going to step down, and that's what he conveys in his New Year's message to the public a few hours after that soiree. He's playing for time. He's playing for time to rebuild the defenses on the Yangtze and to hold the PLA there. Time perhaps for the US yet to change its mind and come to his aid. Time, if peace negotiations make progress, perhaps to form some kind of coalition government in China, maybe a communist north and a nationalist south, in which some of the essential assets, including his own personal status, would be preserved. And time, of course, to transfer, lest things don't go as well as they might, the key assets of the government, the foreign exchange, the military equipment, the artifacts and cultural treasures of China somewhere south, possibly to Taiwan, if need be, possibly to other destinations. Those are his calculations. How about Mao? Where do we find him at this particular juncture? Well, in very different surroundings. He's in the village of Xibaipo in Hebei province, about 200 miles southwest of Beijing. And he is in mud-walled huts and accommodation, along with other key leaders of the Chinese Communist Party, Zhou Enlai, Liu Shaoqi, Zhu De, the military commander, plotting the conquest of South China and the creation of the institutions for the People's Republic of China that they are determined to create. Already, there is a unified communist government of North China, and Mao is pleased to announce that the number of troops under his command, as a result of the fall of Manchuria, or the communist conquest of it, is now close to that under Jiang's command, as indeed is in much better shape. The war, therefore, Mao says, could well end more quickly than we anticipated. But victory, even now, won't come easily. Whereas Chiang Kai-shek is announcing to his own people and to the public at large, he's going to step down, peace talks will take place, Mao is relentless and determined. In his remarks, carry the revolution through to the end, he castigates the nationalist leaders as bandits, as venomous snakes, and urges the Chinese people to show them no mercy. Let's move away from that scene of high politics, as it were, in Beijing, and just spend a few moments looking at what is going on in China from the diplomatic perspective, from the strategic dimension, from the positions, respectively, of Washington, Moscow, and London. They all have big stakes in the theater of contest for China's future, and perhaps no one quite so much as the United States. Here they have a dimension and a dilemma which is perhaps peculiar to the American foreign policy of the period. The Americans had sunk moral capital as well as material assets in Jangs' regime, but he had not turned up trumps. He had not been a successful Democrat, and he could not even be a successful dictator. He was no bulwark against communism. And recall that communism was making advances in Eastern Europe at this time, as well as in Asia. Something had to be done to stop it. But quite what eluded the policymakers in the United States? Jiang was too weak and not credible enough to be supported, yet he was too important even now to abandon. Perhaps the Americans thought he might hold on somewhere. Perhaps Mao might moderate his revolution in a way that Tito in Yugoslavia seemed to be doing, and the Americans could live with the consequences. It turned out not to be so. Of course, a different spirit prevailed in Moscow on the part of Stalin, where there had been consistent support right from the very beginnings of the Chinese Communist Party 100 years ago, almost to the day, in the form of advice, in the form of financial aid, in the form of weapons. One of the things it might be interesting to look out for, incidentally, as the Chinese Communist Party celebrates its centenary, is the part and the role attributed by them to the Soviet Union in securing their victory. Stalin was aware of the contribution the Soviet Union had made. Mao was almost unreserved in his admiration for the great Soviet leader, but Stalin was nothing if not suspicious. What kind of man really was this Mao Zedong? China was moving inexorably, it seemed, to the global socialist camp, but that itself created problems. It would not, China, be a satellite like Poland, like Czechoslovakia, like Hungary, and the other East European states would become. It was too big, it was too distant, it was too independent for that. And this Mao Zedong, was he really a Marxist in the conventional mold? Might he be China's Tito indeed? That would be a problem. An even bigger problem, Stalin thought, was that he could be Asia's Lenin and challenge eventually, if he was successful, the whole global leadership that Stalin had sought to impose on the socialist camp. So the Soviets are pleased, but Stalin is reserved and worried, even now, throughout 1949 until the very end, that Mao's recklessness, Mao's advance might yet drag the United States in, and the Soviet Union would find itself in conflict there with a formidable enemy. Let's spend just a moment or so looking at how it was seen from London's point of view. And here there weren't moral assets and interests, but there were material ones. In Shanghai in particular, British companies were heavily invested. London didn't want to lose that commercial advantage. Could a way be found, thought the pugnacious Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin, who you see on the left here, to keep a foot in the door? Might it be possible to recognize the People's Republic of China, keep British interests going in Shanghai, and no less important, preserve British prestige and position in Hong Kong? That was considered vital by Attlee and Bevin as well. There was the broader empire also in Southeast Asia to reflect upon, in Malaya especially, where there were large numbers of Chinese people, as there were in what were called the Straits settlements. The victory of Mao in China was regarded as something of a potentially turbulent nature that could upset the order. Such were the views as they were seen from the perspective of the diplomatists. If we spend a moment just thinking about Jiang's own house, the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, it was, as Jiang could well testify, a house divided. And the fact that he stepped down increased those tensions, particularly tensions between two men, Li Zongren on the left, Bai Chongxi on the right, who were members of the Guangxi clique, and Jang himself, the head of the central government. Li Zongren had become acting president, now Jang had stepped down. Bai Chongxi controlled the most formidable nationalist military resources. He was sitting in Wuhan, in the middle of the Yangtze, in the middle of China, facing off Lin Biao's forces. Jang couldn't trust the Guangxi leaders. The Guangxi leaders couldn't trust Jang. This was a house divided, and the story of the conflict between these two factions runs through 1949, and indeed is responsible for the rapid demise of the nationalist regime. If we spend a moment or two thinking about the military dimension and staying with Bai Chongxi, a different picture of the nationalist general here on the right, it's worth thinking about 1949 as a kind of duel or contest between two of the best generals on either side. On the left is a man called Lin Biao. These two men, separated by an age difference of a decade or so, something like that, Bai being the older man, have much in common. They were committing personally from early phase of their life to the cause of China's rejuvenation and revolution. It was just that they fell in different camps. Lin Biao was born in Hubei, and from the moment he went to school, took much more interest in ideology than he did his lessons. Bai Chongxi from Guilin in Guangxi was of a similar ilk. He joined the youth soldiers that took part in the 1911 revolution that overthrew the Qing dynasty. These two men had form. They had ranged their forces against each other as early as 1946 in the earlier phase of the civil war between the communists and the nationalists up in Manchuria. And Bai Chongxi, generally speaking, had come off better. In 1949, it was a different story. Bai has an army of about 300,000 people in Wuhan. Lin Biao has marched south with a much bigger force, better equipped, better paid, better motivated. The story of 1949 in terms of the conflict between these two men is one of utter victory for Lin Biao as he pushed Bai ever further south and destroyed his armies in their home base of Guangxi. And at the end of the year, we find Bai Chongxi, a most distinguished nationalist general, with a headquarters in a disused Catholic church on Hainan Island. His armies destroyed, his career in ruins. He has, at the end of the year, no future but to fly to Taipei, where Jang has relocated and his life slips into obscurity. I want now to move away from these matters of the military, from diplomacy, and from internal politics, and just to remind ourselves the horrors of civil war, the fact that people are forced to move. And across China, especially south of the Yangtze, the roads are full of refugees, the ships are full of passengers, the railway trains likewise. There is an enormous desire to escape the fighting, to get away from communism. Homes are left behind, families and friends likewise. There was at this time a foreign head, indeed there was since the institution was created, of the China Maritime Customs Service, an American called Lester Knox Little. His diary was an important source for understanding 1949, and he made what I thought rather an odd comment in it. You'll see it there. The Chinese think that if they can just go somewhere, anywhere, they will be safe. They have a fleeing complex. Knox Little seemed not to realize that so too did he. He fled from Shanghai to Guangzhou or Canton, from Canton to Hong Kong, and ended up in Taiwan. And of course, so did many, many other people, as these little scenes here illustrate. I want to spend a moment or two just thinking about a couple of individuals who were caught up in this maelstrom. One of them is Mei Jun, the woman you see pictured in later life in the left of your screen. She was 24 or thereabouts when she decided that she had to leave her village in Zhejiang, the prosperous, generally speaking, part of southeast China. Her husband was in the nationalist paramilitary, and she strongly suspected that when the communists took over her village, she might well be in trouble. She marched out of her village with her young son strapped to her back, turning to her mother and saying, "I will be back soon." She took a crowded train to the city where she believed her husband was, and she decided to leave her son with her mother-in-law in Hunan province, the remote southern Chinese countryside. She headed solo, having done that to Guangzhou, the major city of South China. But as the months passed in 1949, that city too began to fill up with refugees, with soldiers, with those fleeing. She decided she would have to go north again, this time going against the flow of people, a very difficult and dangerous task, to collect her son and bring him to safety. She was reunited with her son, but in very tempestuous circumstances. The little family went back to the station from which she had alighted and managed to find a train that was going south, but it was absolutely packed. And they decided, after all, that it would be safer for the youngster to remain in the countryside rather than go with her. By 1950, early months, weeks indeed, of that year, we find Mei Jun on Hainan Island, where we had last seen the defeated Bai Chongxi. She is escaping with crowds of soldiers and civilians to Taiwan, there now being no place of safety left on the mainland or on that large island down there in the southwest. She recalled that people pulled themselves up ladders to get over the ship's rails and into the boats like so many spiders. Many could not make it and fell into the water. Cries of help went up, but no one paid any attention. Cotton shoes bobbed up and down in the harbor. Wounded soldiers who had protected the retreat lay on the dockside crying in pain. Those on board the ships could only look back helplessly, abandoning them to their fate. She eventually arrived in Kaohsiung, the major port in southern Taiwan, some 15 months after she'd set out from her home village. And soon after her birth, incidentally, soon after her arrival, she gave birth to her daughter, Long Yingtai, who's a famous Taiwanese writer and whose recollections and discussions and interviews with those like her mother who fled formed an important source. A moment or two in the company of this man, Ya Xian, Wang Xinglin, who became a Taiwanese poet, also illustrates the human drama that featured so prominently in these years. He was from Henan province, north of the Yangtze, and he was a middle school student when the fighting intensified in 1948. His teachers decided that they would move all of his classmates and indeed the pupils from other schools in the district south to safety. They would educate them on the road, it might be in temples, it might be in inns, but anywhere to get these young folk out of harm's way. We find him around the middle of 1949 in Hunan, and the decision is being taken, where should these children, now in their hundreds, go next for safety? Many of them go down into Guangxi and indeed end up in what was then French Indochina. But young Ya Xian and his immediate pals see in Hunan, and a city in Hunan, a poster on the wall, which calls for young men of resolution, ready for self-sacrifice, to join a new army being raised in Taiwan. That's an army being raised by Sun Li Ren, a distinguished nationalist general who is trying to replenish the nationalist forces. And Ya Xian and his pals go south to Guangzhou, catch a boat, and end up in the youth corps, never to return to the mainland. If we're thinking about 1949 and the conquest of China by the communists, then we need, of course, just to understand a little of what happened on the Yangtze in the spring of that year. As we saw, Jiang and the nationalists were determined to try and stop the PLA from making this crossing. Someone in their defense team told the US ambassador that he thought that as a natural barrier, the Yangtze, China's longest river, was worth about 300,000 soldiers. Mao, of course, was determined to cross the Yangtze. Peace negotiations did begin in Beijing, and it was the aim of the nationalist side of those negotiations to stop the PLA from crossing. Mao would have none of that. For him, peace negotiations should really be thought of as the terms under which Chiang Kai-shek's army and government should surrender. If you look at what the PLA soldiers themselves thought about the crossing, however, you find a different picture from Mao's determination. I put this bit of doggerel on the screen because it was widely going around the ranks of the PLA as they stared across the river and looked south. The army, remember, was mostly made up of northerners. South China was culturally, linguistically, and in terms of cuisine, and in terms of climate, a very different place. It wasn't so much the fear of fighting that the PLA soldiers who authored this had in mind. It was the strangeness of the environment they would soon find themselves in. The communists crossed first of all in the area I'm indicating with my cursor here, in Wuhu, south of Nanjing. They did so on the night of April the 20th and the 21st. And it was a remarkably well-organized and well-planned undertaking involving an armada of hundreds and hundreds of small boats, the recruitment of sea men or river men capable of navigating these craft. At 5 a.m., the communist artillery opened up and the boats emerged carrying these soldiers. An observer noted the troops embarked with outlights lying on the gunwales, their weapons resting on the edge of the boats. Thousands of white and rust-red sails were hoisted to the wind. The boats pushed off with cheering cargoes. A couple of days later, Time magazine told its international audience that nearly 1 million communist troops along a 400-mile front had poured across the Yangtze, nationalist China's last great defensive barrier. They'd swept the government positions aside like puny earthworks in a raging tide. They moved with impressive speed. In 4 days, they took Nanjing, cut off Shanghai, and captured half a dozen strategic nationalist cities. The PLA soldiers who had begun by complaining about what they might encounter across the other side of the river were soon complaining that they could not fight because they couldn't catch the nationalists. They were retreating so far and so fast. Of course, the military could topple Chiang Kai-shek's regime, but it couldn't run China very easily. And that's where the auxiliaries came in, the Southbound Carders, the Nansha Ganbu, as they're called in Chinese. A fellow called Deng Xiaoping, as early as August 1948, told the Central Committee of the Communist Party that based on the experience of North China, if they were to administer the central region, for every area with a population of 100 million, we'll need 30 to 40,000 loyal carders. And the Southbound Carders were that phalanx of people dedicated to the cause. They were mostly young people, idealistic people. Many of them were students. They were those enthused by the idea of building a new China, capable of lifting their countrymen and women out of poverty, and of course, standing up to the West. They were to run the territories occupied by the PLA. They were to carry out the preparations for land reform, which was such an important part of the communist platform. Detailed regulations were drawn up governing their conditions. Each cadre was to be issued with one suit of clothes and one pair of shoes for the journey south. If they were above a certain rank, they could take with them one ox, one horse and rider. Those at another level could, when traveling in a group of 40, hire a truck to carry their belongings. Anyone who owned a bicycle was welcome to take it with them, but there was no question of the party paying for repairs. The arrival in South China of the Southbound Carders had a profound effect. It shook up the provincial loyalties and local attachments that were so important in China and had been indeed for centuries. These were people from the north who went to the south. The flow of revolution was in that direction. Originally, the communists had been in the south and moved now. Now that was being reversed. The other thing the communists had to do, in addition to land reform, that great promise, it's worth pausing here just for a moment to say, of course, these armies that we have referred to pitted against each other were peasant armies. What the communist rank and file were promised and given was land reform. What the nationalist rank and file were promised but never given was land reform. So their incentive to fight was rather different. Land reform was critical. The revolution was grounded in its rural setting, where it had been generated in the 1920s and 1930s. But suddenly in 1949, the communists had to do something they've never done before, and that is run cities. For months leading up to that year, Mao and the Central Committee had banged home this message of we need trained professional cadres to run complex cities that we're fearful of, that we have no experience of. In 1949, the cities, Nanjing, Shanghai, Hangzhou, the list is there, fell one after another. It's worth just saying a couple of things about the way in which they did so. In only one nationalist city in 1949, and that was Taiyuan, the capital of Shanxi, was there bitter, protracted fighting for control of that metropolis. And that was a separate case. That province was run by a fellow called Yan Xishan, who was often, like the Guangxi clique, at odds with Jangs. He had nowhere to go, or those anyway who fought for him had nowhere to go and everything to fight for. But in the other cities, the communist conquest was easy. It's important to say that in none of them was there a significant urban uprising demanding that the nationalists leave and the communists come in. But the communists found it easy to take over. There were skirmishes, there was some rearguard fighting in Shanghai and its environs, but those were mostly to do with retreat, and they were not to do with fighting for the city. The city, of course, was the home of China's and international firms' presence. And here is a vignette worth pondering for a moment or so. Liu Hongshang was a Shanghai capitalist of a significant and influential kind. He was into cement, he was into matches, he was into flour. It was a purely Chinese concern. He, like many others, but perhaps more so given his assets at stake, had much on his mind as the communists grew closer. He sent for a period a couple of his sons to Taiwan to develop business there. But that didn't work out. And he decided that he would not follow Chiang Kai-shek, not so much because of what he was doing in Taiwan, but because of how he had mishandled the issue of the economy in Shanghai closer to home. He thought Hong Kong, therefore, might be a better bet. As the communist armies in April and May approached Shanghai, one of his sons said, "Dad, we ought to stay here. The communists have promised there's room for us businessmen." What Dad didn't know at that time was son was a secret member of the Chinese Communist Party and was working for the underground. But like all good fathers, he didn't listen to his son, and he decided to go to Hong Kong and take some of his assets there. He spent a few months there. His parent, I beg your pardon, his wife, his mistress, his brothers entreated him to return. Shanghai under the communists is just fine, they said. The person who, however, seems to have had the greatest impact on Liu Hongshang was emissaries of Zhou Enlai, who beseeched him to return. They knew that if Liu Hongshang went back to liberated Shanghai, then that would put the minds of many businessmen and women and capitalists at ease. And so in November 1949, Liu Hongshang secretly boarded a freighter bound for Tianjin. He went to Peking, met Mao, met Zhou Enlai, and indeed returned to Shanghai. He at first publicly endorsed the new regime, but not many years had passed, about the middle of the 1950s to be precise, when he had good cause to reflect on his decision, because his enterprises were nationalized in common with most other private enterprises. Well, we're reaching the end of our journey, but we cannot complete this without passing through Tiananmen Square. October the 1st is the inauguration of Mao's New World, the birth of the People's Republic of China. This is the first scale, large scale public outing for Mao, and the leadership is worried that it will go right, and it's tightly choreographed like all great communist ceremonies are. Nothing must be allowed to go wrong, including the spontaneity and enthusiasm. And what we see unfolding in this period is the essential main lines of China's political economy, political atmosphere, methods and approaches that are very present to this very day. China is going to be a people's democratic dictatorship. In other words, the party, which represents the people, according to its own logic, is going to be in charge. And those who are not the people, that means people who support the Kuomintang, that means landlords, that means those with ties to international business, are going to be subject to dictatorship. The Chinese are required to go to meetings and to be inculcated in the new propaganda and disciplines on a scale never seen before. Minds are going to be reshaped, as well as allegiances and behavior. China is going to lean to one side, as Mao put it. The Soviet Union is the first country to recognize the People's Republic of China, and Mao announces defiantly that China is in the socialist camp. The language, the institutions of China of today are created and imposed here. I say imposed because that is true in certain respects, but they were embraced also by many people who, as we've indicated earlier in our journey, were enthusiastic about what Mao had to offer and thought it was a far better alternative than that Jangs had delivered during the long years he was in power. And so penultimately in our journey, we need just to reflect a little on the situation in a place that is special to many of us, which of course is Hong Kong. Throughout 1949, the British were concerned about the triumph of communism on the mainland and what it might mean for Hong Kong. There were many signs that the Chinese would stop on the border and not try and take back the colony. But what I didn't mention, and you may have noticed this, some of you, when we were talking about the crossing of the Yangtze, was that caught up in that episode was a British frigate, HMS Amethyst, which for reasons still not clearly explained, decided at the precise moment that the communists were making their assault to sail upriver to Nanjing. It was shelled. There was heavy loss of life amongst officers and ratings, and the ship was essentially stranded in the upper reaches of the lower reaches, I should say, of the Yangtze until it's made its escape in July of that year and in customary British tradition, a disaster and a cock-up was turned into a great triumph. What the authorities in Hong Kong drew from this was the lesson that the Chinese communists were not afraid of foreigners, that they would shell them, that they would kill them, and they would do what was necessary to carry out their revolution. Would they then stop at the border in October and November 1949 as they completed their conquest of South China? Well, as we know, they did, and here is a rather striking picture of a British policeman in fine-looking shorts up against a communist irregular along the frontier of the colony and the Chinese mainland. The man on the left pondering the situation is the long-standing governor, Alexander Grantham, one of the few governors of Hong Kong who had begun his career as a Far Eastern cadet in that colony, learning Cantonese. It quickly became clear that the communists wanted to leave, for the time being, Hong Kong alone. And the territory settled into a pattern which prevailed until about a year or two ago, frankly, beyond the transfer of power from Britain to China, leaving it alone as a largely autonomous entity until the present president of China and party secretary decided that was no longer satisfactory. And so we complete our journey in Taiwan. What Chiang Kai-shek has been doing during these years, when notionally he's been out of power, is planning a bastion to which he is relocating assets and from which he might make his last stand. And that bastion was Taiwan. Taiwan was attractive for geographical reasons. It was an island. 100 miles separated it from the mainland. The communists might be able to cross the Yangtze. Crossing the straits on any scale was another matter. It was an island, moreover, that had been well run by the Japanese until 1945 and had no indigenous communist activity. But the prospects of the island by the end of the year in question, 1949, were rather poor, and it was widely regarded by the Americans, perhaps by many in Jangs' own camp, that the nationalist government, which had relocated there, making its capital Taipei, could not long endure a determined assault. And Mao had instructed the East China Field Army to prepare that assault. What rescued Taiwan from liberation, as the communists call it, was not events in China so much as what happened in Korea and the outbreak of the conflict there, adventurism on the part of Kim Il-sung, and then the participation of China in the form of its volunteer armies in Korea, decided the Americans to cordon off Taiwan, to make it part of their security territory, if you like, and to promise to defend it. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where the year ended, one might say, and where our story also concludes, but a story with a long shadow, as this slide seeks to depict. We are in the midst, or we should say, I suppose more accurately, the Chinese people are still in the midst of one of the world's longest running civil wars. China is still disunited. That's quite unusual. Usually in history, globally ascendant powers, think of Germany in Europe, think of Italy to some extent, think even of the United Kingdom and certainly of the United States, have gone through their process of national reunification before they have asserted themselves outside their frontiers. In the case of China, that phase of national reunification has yet to take place. And judging from the policy of the military and the People's Republic of China towards the still existing Republic of China on Taiwan, then that situation seems likely to change. The pressures are mounting. civil war, as has been pointed out quite wisely, is the worst kind of conflict because when the fighting stops, the wounds do not easily heal. And China still is a wounded nation, and it still is, I submit, at risk of further injury, not only to the Chinese people, but to the wider East Asian region, and indeed much further beyond. That's where I'll stop this journey. Thank you for accompanying me through many hundreds of miles of terrain and many months of time. I'll hand back to Jonathan and welcome observations, questions, and of course, criticisms.
Thank you very much, Graham. That was terrific. I'm going to just maybe put one or two points to you and give a chance for members of the audience to field questions through Chris. So I'm just going to focus on a couple of points. One, you said at the beginning, and I think it's something that's very well known, and you said it also at the end, that the purpose from the very beginning of the Chinese Communist Party was to change China, to change the institutions of the society and the way the country worked. But my observation, and I think of some others, that in recent years, maybe the last 20 years or so, we've almost seen a recreation, or what appears to be a recreation, of imperial China. I wonder what your thoughts are about that. Have you, what's your impression of what has happened to China in the last 20 years or so?
Thank you. That's a very pertinent question and also a very big question. If one is referring to imperial China, one needs, of course, to have an understanding of what that entity was like. One needs to have some notion about the reach of the state, the loyalty of people to imperial China, the ability of the country to raise financial assets, to marshal resource, to deal with other countries. And plainly, when you think about those characteristics of the imperial state, they are very different, naturally, from the China of the 21st century. There's going to be marks of the past on a country as significant as China, just as there are on every national entity and culture, and they're embedded. But I think we need not be too beguiled by that and still understand something of the novelty of new China and the fact that power is exercised by a remarkably successful political party, judged at least by the duration of its power over so many people, and despite extraordinary setbacks, many of them self-inflicted.
I agree with you on that. I wonder how much any drive towards political reform are squashed by that sort of chaos, that remaining chaos from the last years of the Civil War and the movement of people. The memory of that sometimes seems to restrain people from pushing for any kind of significant political reform in China. Is that a reasonable assessment? And not only, of course, in that 1945-49 period, but I mean, chaos going back in history. China has always been marked by periods of chaos.
Thank you. It's difficult to do what I'm about to do, which is to make a generalization about so many people of different kind and nature in such a complex country. But with that proviso, let me say that I think you're right. The chief selling point of the Chinese Communist Party's current means of rule seems to me to be this. If we are not in charge, and we mean in charge, two things are likely to happen, and they're quite closely related. One is we will have chaos and disorder, and the other is foreigners will boss us about. And what we're ensuring is two things that matter a great deal to many Chinese people. One is order, security, and prosperity, and the other is freedom from being bossed about, or to put it more positively, a rising global stature. So those would be my simple propositions to put forward in reinforcement of your contention. But I'd just like to add the codicil that both of those are very dangerous concepts, easy to mismanage, and potentially extremely disruptive if the party cannot guarantee prosperity and order and does not manage to achieve increased international stature and prestige for the Chinese people.
And just one maybe final question about Taiwan. I, as you know, look at this much more from a Taiwanese side of the question, and there's no doubt in my mind that there is no political, historic, legal, moral, or any other serious claim to Taiwan by the People's Republic of China. But yet the Chinese Communist Party seems to remain fixated on this issue. And I find it a little hard to understand why. But it's, and I think there is a danger there because, just adding on to what you have just said, one of the recourses that the Chinese Communist Party may have when, if economic or other superiorities fail them, is of course intense patriotism and nationalism, and of course the claim to Taiwan could fall into that category. What do you see just as the essence of the CCP's insistence that that Taiwan has to be conquered?
I think no Chinese Communist Party leader could survive the relinquishment by the party of a claim to Taiwan. And that is true for several reasons, but let me just throw a couple at you. One is, as we've talked in our journey this morning about the creation of two Chinas, there sits in Taiwan another China. It calls itself the Republic of China. Now, fair enough, it has very limited international scope for activity, and that is narrowing, but it still exists. It still sits there as a blister, if you like, not a very nice analogy, I know, perhaps you'll permit it for the purposes of this example, on the body politic, as a challenge, as defiance of the kind the Chinese Communist Party, with its excessive sensitivity on matters of face, prestige, pride, simply cannot put up with. The other approach to think about here is the strategic one. China has an enormous maritime coastline, and its claim to the South China Sea and the East China Sea, both of them legally dubious, is based on what might be considered an understandable desire to protect its own approaches and to push potential hostile forces 100, 200, 300 miles further out. As long as Taiwan is not in Chinese Communist Party hands, it's a weak link in that chain, which is precisely the reason why the Americans, the Japanese, and others hope that it remains the case. Because if the Chinese Communist Party manage to get hold of Taiwan, they push the frontier the maritime frontier out another 100, 200, 300 miles, which completely alters the geostrategic calculus.
Thank you, Graham. Thank you very much. And let me pass it now to Chris to take us to the end of the session.
Yes, thank you, Graham. Thank you, Jonathan. We have a few questions here, and the first one's from Phil Calvert, and he's discussing or mentioning your book, Graham, about the divide between the North and the South, and you mentioned the crossing of the Yangtze. And Phil asks, do you think this North-South distinction, along with the rural-urban distinction, affected the culture of CCP governance of China after 1949? So I guess it's a case of the North-South influence and how it impacted in the South in terms of governance.
Thank you, Phil, for that a very interesting question. I happen to think that the fact that it was, generally speaking, northern armies that imposed communist victory on the South, and that it was rural forces that triumphed over urban forces, that had a lot to do with the evolution of the Chinese Communist Revolution after 1949, often in baleful ways. The city-rural dimension is perhaps the most easiest for the purposes of this discussion to seize upon, but the Chinese Communist Party was remade after its urban beginnings in Shanghai, in the remote countryside, and it was infused with a peasant rural mentality. And that was imposed across the country as a whole to the detriment of what many Chinese regarded as the more acceptable, finer, sophisticated, educated aspects of life. The casualties were principally intellectuals who, within a year or so of 1949, indeed in some cases slightly earlier, were coming under enormous pressure to align their thoughts and behavior with the new regime. And that, of course, became the great school that all Chinese were required to go through. So that rural origins of the Chinese Communist Revolution certainly had a very big impact. The North-South issue is slightly more nuanced, I think. But if you take, for example, the provinces of Guangdong, in which Canton, Guangzhou, is situated, or Guangxi, from which the Guangxi clique came from, then I rather suspect deliberately northern armies were imposed to snuff out the spirit of independence, of potentially rebellion against the center that those areas had long been famous for, and something of the vitality and spirit of the Chinese nation, again to generalize, was, I feel pretty sure, snuffed out as a result.
So thank you, Graham. We have a lot of questions on Taiwan. There are three of them. I'm just going to combine them all together because we've got Don, Leslie, and Paul asking about Taiwan, and you have spoken about it. And the question is of course, is it the next target of the Chinese government in Beijing? And you have spoken about that. But I think if I dwell on what Leslie has to say on this, her aspect, and she asks, is it time for democracies such as Canada to more fulsomely back Taiwan in concrete ways? Is there anything that we could be doing to support Taiwan at this point?
It's a question that I often think about, and many people do, both China specialists and those engaged in diplomacy, and people who are not professionally attached as well. I suppose if one is instinctively sympathetic to democracy and unhappy about the suppression of freedoms broadly described in China proper and in Hong Kong, there would be a good deal of satisfaction to be had from one's country if it recognized Taiwan. The reluctance of diplomatists and politicians to do that is based on the fear that it would actually trigger an outcome that is precisely to be avoided, i.e. the conquest of Taiwan. So then the question is whether there are more subtle ways to deal with this and ensure greater living space for Taiwan. I am not sufficiently in tune with contemporary diplomacy to suggest what they might be, but I would like to see some creative solutions to that problem because the current line of strategic ambiguity, that is to say, one of the deterrents facing the Chinese mainland is uncertainty about whether the Americans and or others might defend Taiwan. That seems to be wearing a little bit thin, and a new set of creative policies are required. Ultimately, I suppose, and here lies the rub, a discourse and a set of policies of this nature would need to be undertaken in discussion with somebody in Beijing. And that somebody, I'm afraid, is certainly not Xi Jinping. So for the time being, that particular route seems to be closed.
And now to our last question, which comes from Joseph Caron. And he says, Graham, thank you for a superb presentation. And his question is, if you had been in Shanghai in December 1949, not knowing the future, what would you have thought would be the future of China?
Well, thank you, Joseph, for that rather difficult question. I, like many, in common with the previous question, have thought about this, as one does, as a sentient and hopefully sensitive observer of these events. What would I do? Well, with hindsight, I would hope I'd have left. I was thinking, as I saw 500 Hong Kong policemen enter the offices of Apple Daily in Hong Kong earlier this week, that this was even more drastic than what the communists did to the non-communist media in nationalist China. The contrast struck me in that sense. But the effect was the same. The Apple Daily will cease publication and never reappear again, and non-communist media in Shanghai never appeared again, nor will they for quite a while. So here is the most difficult question facing people of 1949, to go or to stay. To go where? Because many of those who left didn't know, indeed, even where Taiwan was, let alone that they could make a life there. And those who stayed comforted themselves with the idea, widely believed among certain sections of the society, that Mao wasn't really a communist and that even he and his party and army would have to succumb to the forces of Chinese and Shanghainese entrepreneurialism, and some modus vivendi would be reached. Well, it wasn't. And many people, of course, paid the price. So what I've done in my rather cunning way is not to answer that question at all, but to surround the question with various dilemmas, only to reinforce the fact that I haven't answered it. But I'll conclude by saying that I hope a voice inside me would say, this isn't going to work and I need to leave.
Thank you, Graham. And this brings us to the end of our session today. And so I'd like to say, first of all, thank you to Jonathan for being the moderator. And of course, Graham from Zooming in all the way from the UK. It's been a terrific end, actually, to what is our 2020-21 season. That we've been able to do all of this by Zoom as we've lived through the period of COVID, and actually get into, in this particular case, of really what we would call a deep dive into a period of history that many of us know a little bit about, but don't know the details. And as a historian myself, the details are always fundamental to understanding what is happening in today's world. And you've given us a wonderful look at 1949. So we greatly appreciate you taking the time today for us. So Graham, thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure.
And it has been wonderful. And for those of you that have joined us today, thank you for spending your time with us. We have quite a lot of events still coming up in the fall period. We will be back to in-person events, which will be terrific. And our AGM will be on September 7th, and that'll be by Zoom. But I just wanted to give you a quick idea of some of the events that we do have coming up in the fall period. For example, in September, we're going to have a look at Afghanistan. And this is the withdrawal of NATO and, of course, the United States from Afghanistan. And we're going to be very fortunate to have Christopher Gibbons join us. He's the fellow in charge of the Afghanistan file in Global Affairs Canada. And Christopher and I served in our embassy in Kabul for a year back in 2009, 2010. So we're going to have a look at Afghanistan from the perspective of Global Affairs Canada. And we'll also be joined by Corey Levine, who is a CIC Victoria member. Corey is currently in Kabul. She's been there for 6 months. She's been in and out of the country for 20 years. So we'll have a very good chance to talk about what is happening there in September. And then in October, very happy to announce that we have Nathan Vanderklip coming to the Union Club. It's going to be our first in-person lunch, and he is the Asia correspondent for the Globe and Mail. So we're going to have a chance to revisit China and the region as well. So if you are not a CIC Victoria member, please consider joining us. We'd love to have you. Support our work, support our digital online magazine, Open Canada, as well. So that's enough from me on the advertising side. Thank you again, Graham. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.